I think that yes, this is a constitutionally mandated thing that the president must be sworn in within 5 days after being elected by the National Assembly, but also because the executive authority of the Republic vests in the president, who then delegates that authority to a deputy president and a cabinet of ministers. This is an important moment for us to witness the beginning of the formation of the 7th administration of a democratic South Africa, and the beginning of the process of the position of the ministers and the leaders that are really going to determine policy and have to oversee the implementation of that policy and governance of the country for the next 5 years.
And that's, of course, going to be a very interesting exercise because the ANC now, as our previous guest indicated, have to consult more broadly. Mm-hmm. It's now not just about consulting within the ANC's structures, but and its alliance partners. But now there are other partners, the partners in the government of national unity, who have to be consulted. And again, just looking at how things have played out so far, Dr. Mbete, what's your assessment of the government of national unity?
Well, indeed, first thing I'd like to say is that to some degree, President Ramaphosa has some practice in managing, factions and groups that disagree.
Right.
From his first term as the President of the Republic, managing his own party and the different interests within that. And so this seems like it's just going to be a sort of a bigger version of what he's already had to deal with.
I mean, we also told he was the chief negotiator in our transition to democracy. So, hopefully he's got the experience.
So he does have some practice of it. I think that what we have seen and what we saw initially with the negotiations around the GNU, which is a form of coalition, right? Was that the negotiations themselves were kept quite tight. They were kept quite secret. There weren't a lot of leaks. Things began to leak quite late in the process when they were now finalizing the finer details of the statement of intent, which bode well for the way that arrangement would work in being able to keep those discussions confidential for so long. But of course, what we've seen in the last 24 hours is these different versions of interpretation around the idea of how decisions are made, so sufficient consensus, but also who can be included in the GNU and who makes that decision. And so I think that we're starting to see, and it's not necessarily cracks in the process, but I think that we are seeing the fault lines on which we can expect to have
which are not surprising
contestation going forward. And that is not surprising because what you have here is different parties with different constituencies, and I think this is a very important thing, as well as different ways of working that now have to find a way to work together cooperatively to govern the Republic.
Without a doubt. I mean, as we have our conversation, of course, a number of other heads of state are arriving. We've just spotted Emerson Mnangagwa, a neighbor of ours. He's the president of Zimbabwe. In fact, it reminds me of the different rhetoric around migration in this country, and even organizations like the PA's own drive and what they will be focusing on if they were to get a seat in cabinet as part of this GNU. Earlier on, we also spotted Felix Tshisekedi, the head of the DRC. The president of Mauritius was also present earlier on. So much of that is taking place, announced, of course, by International Relations Minister for a few more moments at least.
For a few more minutes.
Naledi Pandor, who's leading some of those proceedings.
Indeed. And as we watch that, Dr. Mbete, I suppose also important this moment, not just for South Africa, but of course for the rest of the region and the continent, because we know of the brotherhood, the camaraderie, the solidarity between former liberation movements on the continent. We know, they've shared spaces, and the bond between them is really, really tight. So looking at what's happening in South Africa, there has been, of course, rumblings of what this could potentially mean for other countries.
Yes, certainly. I think that we must remember, though, that Southern Africa is an outlier in the continent by still being governed mostly by liberation movements. For the rest of the continent, you go to West Africa, you go to East Africa, and you go North and Central Africa, the original liberation movements have lost power in those places for the most part, or lost power for a while and then regained power. So in Southern Africa, it really is Zambia, where the liberation movement lost their election in 1991, the first multi-party election for a number of years, and has had a number of changes of governing of ruling parties since then. And so I think that for Southern Africa, this in some way represents a new era of governance. In some ways are catching up to the rest of the continent, where the certainty of liberation movement rule is no longer guaranteed. There is no longer certainty about that. And what that then means around the way that those parties interact with each other. Because remember, the ANC is still going to be the government of South Africa, a large part of the government of South Africa, by virtue of having its president as the executive authority of the republic. It will anchor whatever governance structure there is, but it doesn't govern completely, doesn't have a complete mandate anymore. And so how that affects its interaction with its fellow liberation movements in the region, I think will be really interesting.
Yeah, without a doubt. King
His Excellency, His Majesty
the third
King
there
Letsie
from
the third.
Lesotho, of course, some people in a tongue-in-cheek way saying a province of the country, but officially not at all a sovereign state. In fact, we have seen several other distinguished dignitaries, so to speak, but there you have it, His Majesty King Letsie III, and now what we're hearing being introduced there is also King Mswati III from Eswatini, of course, Ingonyama of the Eswatini people.
And of course, arriving to warm applause here from the dignitaries in the amphitheater here at the Union Buildings. And this an indication that we are now fast approaching the very important ceremony for which we are all gathered here today. These are the dignitaries that would be taking their seats on the stage behind where the President and of course the Chief Justice and those who will be administering that oath of office will be sitting.
Without a doubt. And so as we continue, I suppose, understanding the different moving parts, Dr. Mbete, South Africa has in some ways always kind of been seen, I'm loath to use the term of the big brother of the continent, but you know, what South Africa says matters. Other heads of state sometimes watch very closely where South Africa goes, whether it comes to our foreign policy. You know, there's a huge interest in our economy and how that is progressing, the state of our democracy as well, as we watch Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, the former deputy president, of course, of the country, also arriving here at the Union Buildings. Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka also putting her name next to a letter that was sent by a collection or collective of women who had asked for women's voices to be included in that GNU, which was very interesting, I think, as a segue to that question.
I was part of drafting that letter, actually, and we had lots of late nights in the composition of it, and just concern, right, about that there'll be regression in not only women's representation, but also placing issues that affect women very firmly on the agenda of the discussions that will be taking place for this GNU. So wanting to remind all the parties that are involved and all the political actors that as 50% of the as 50% of the population, given that the majority of a large proportion of South African children live with women, they don't live with their fathers, that, you know, women's issues, the interests of women are central to the well-being of everybody in the country, and that the issues that affect women are not just, although it's very important to speak about gender-based violence and other things, it's also, you know, the economy, transport, infrastructure, all of these things must be looked at through a gendered lens. And so just to remind all the political parties of that.
And important that we see more, because we talk about this a lot, and we just saw the entry of former Speaker of the National Assembly, Sithembile Mbete, and she obviously was also former Deputy President.
Right.
And followed by the cat, former Premier of Mpumalanga, former Deputy President, David Didi Mabuza.
David Mabuza, some people might say. And to another resounding applause, the former Deputy President arriving here as part of, I suppose, some of the most senior officials who are part of South Africa's government being welcomed here. And as you mentioned earlier on, it's a clear indication that we're very much approaching the start of the official program at this stage, when we start welcoming the former leaders of our own country. As you mentioned, Sithembile Mbete also arriving earlier on, whilst we're speaking, interestingly enough, around women representation in government, which will hopefully continue in this government of national unity.
Well, we certainly hope so, because it's a battle of attrition, Dr. Mbete. And unfortunately, when the stakes are high, unfortunately, it is the women who suffer the most.
Certainly, and we've seen that even on the lists that were sent to Parliament by the different political parties, that women's the majority of women in those lists is usually in the second half of the list, not close to the top, which means that, in any event, regardless of what a party gets, the people that are most likely to get in are the men in that party and not the women. And we often see it in the appointments, let's say, to ministerial positions. It'll be something to be really watching out for in this GNU. You hear that loud applause.
Yes. The applause for former President Thabo Mbeki, who was, of course, one of the deputy presidents in the first government of national unity in 1994. Huge applause for Thabo Mbeki, still hugely popular. And yes.
Indeed. In fact, I think it was his birthday yesterday, if memory serves. It might have been the 18th of June.
18th of June, yes.
Right, which was yesterday. So
18th of June, correct.
Just, I suppose, a year older, so to speak. And we also, of course, know that the ANC really looked to him and several other senior leaders as part of their electioneering campaign. We saw him hit the campaign trail in a number of communities in and around at least Gauteng in the main. And he too has, in some ways, has had a fair share of commentary around the formation of the MK party, what he makes of his successor, Jacob Zuma, and that decision. And I suppose they'll be taking stock now of how impactful that was, right? Because despite all of that, the ANC still lost grip of power, now hovering around 40% of the votes. And despite that, though, as you said, he still has a lot of popularity.
But this is the same former President Thabo Mbeki, remember, who some time ago said, perhaps better fewer, but better.
Yes.
Bemoaning and decrying, I suppose, the quality of membership within the ANC.
Within the ANC, and we've also heard, we see former President Kgalema Motlanthe coming in, and he also said a few years ago that perhaps it might be better for the ANC to lose some power to be able to renew itself. And so both of these leaders having, provided some warning for many years that the ANC may find itself in this position. And that there is a need not just for introspection. And often I think the ANC members, ANC leaders are the best people at diagnosing the ANC. They could put us all analysts out of a job, really. They know better than anyone what the issues are. The question is, can they now get to a point to actually fix the problems that they have identified, to deal with they love this word, tendencies that they feel have crept into the party that have led to the situation where we are now, where the party got around 40% in the election.
The members perhaps not fitting through the eye of the needle anymore.
Yes.
And, just allowing things to go for way too long. And as you say, no one is better than analyzing the ANC than the ANC itself. Nobody does more research on the ANC than the ANC itself. They, for example, knew that they would probably get around 40 some odd. I was speaking to someone who said to me they thought around 45, 43, 45. They were quite surprised that it was slightly lower than that as well, but they knew that there was something coming.
Yes, but remember also, Sakina, that in many ways the ANC lost to the ANC in this election. The major disruptor in this election, the MK party, is a breakaway of the ANC under the leadership of former President Zuma, who still claims his ANC membership.
Right.
So he still says that he's a member in good standing of the African National Congress, and their inability to deal with that. Is part of what got them here.
And the question I wonder is, how do you deal with that in such a crucial election, right? I remember there was always questions around the timing of the suspension. When do you expel him? How do you, make sure that doesn't feed into whatever narrative they're pushing ahead? But despite all of that, I suppose we'll be able to look back with the benefit of hindsight to get a sense of whether or not it was the good decision to kind of kick the can down the road as opposed to dealing with it decisively, whatever that looks like. With all, at least from if the list that I have is anything to go by, it feels like the next person to arrive would be the current deputy president, Paul Mashatile, who's also just arrived. And there he is there in frame. And as we wait for the new cabinet, we're also waiting to get a sense of who the new deputy president will be.
And I want to bring Dr. Mbete in on this because from what we are hearing, it would seem as though the other parties have backed down on the position of deputy president. So by all indications, Paul Mashatile should still be the deputy president.
Indeed, and I think that, Paul Mashatile as the deputy president of the ANC, who, let's remember, was not elected at the ANC's elective conference in 2022 as part of President Ramaphosa's slate.
Right.
He kind of made his own way into his role as in the deputy presidency of the ANC. And so it would be very difficult for President Ramaphosa to now remove him from the deputy presidency of the Republic and still keep his political party together. So I was unsurprised when the news came out that the ANC had successfully managed to negotiate with the other parties that actually, please let us retain this deputy presidency and try to influence decision making in another way. And because, Deputy President Mashatile has his own constituency, he has his own support base. And as you had said earlier, Sakina, this challenge of managing not just the external coalition partners, but also maintaining internal divisions, and also, in addition to that, managing the relationship between the ANC and its tripartite alliance partners, the SACP and COSATU, is going to be a major challenge for President Ramaphosa.
An interesting admission yesterday in a conversation on Morning Live with Rolf Meyer, who was, of course, the other chief negotiator during the transition during CODESA. And I asked him what led to the breakup of the first government of national unity. And remember, the National Party walked away from that setup after 2 years. And he said it was mainly because of the pressure from within the National Party. And we know what happened subsequently to the National Party. And we've already seen what's happening with the current parties that are part of this coalition, where you can already see that, the balance of forces within those parties are going to be a factor.
Yes, and Sakina, remember, politics is about power.
101.
We can dress it up in many ways, but politics is about power. It's about the ability to decide who gets what, when, and how. And it's about interests. And so managing the interests of different individuals, of different sectors of society, of different constituencies within a political party is going to be just as important for the stability of this governing coalition for the Republic as managing the interests and the dynamics between the parties that are part of the governing arrangement of South Africa. And I know South Africans hate it when we talk about political parties and, we matter more than the parties do. And that is true, right? In theory, like the citizens matter. But in practice, these political party machinations end up affecting the way that we are governed as citizens, and so we can't shy away from interrogating them.
Yeah, without a doubt. And as we continue with the build-up, and it really feels like anticipation is mounting now, right? We've kind of seen all the people we're expecting, and at any moment, I suppose, there's anticipation of the president-elect. But before that, there you see in frame the current Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, who's been incredibly busy, of course, over the past couple of days, having to preside over a number of sittings, including the first National Assembly, or the first sitting of the first National Assembly, and that of the National Council of Provinces. Without a president, this is the man technically in charge, we're told, if anything were to happen, given the fact that, of course, we have this awkward moment where there is somebody who's just been voted in, now referred to as a president-elect, but hasn't been sworn in just yet. And I'm sure he'll be the most relieved once Cyril Ramaphosa lifts his hand from the Bible, that technically all of that weight shifts back to a Cyril Ramaphosa, who in many ways has an incredible task ahead. But the Chief Justice there, Raymond Zondo, who is, of course, leading one arm of the state, set to retire, I understand, in August.
Yes.
Yep.
So essentially, he's had this moment right at the end of his tenure as a Constitutional Court Justice, and of course he is now the Chief Justice. But it's been an interesting one for him as well. Perhaps something that will go into his book.
Definitely, and I think that what we've seen with this Chief Justice, actually we did have it also with the previous one to some degree, is, so yes, with the two previous sort of Chief Justices of the court, a real politicization of the role of Chief Justice, and they're having to respond, to be involved in factions, sometimes factional, but really political, resolving political disputes more than issues around the law strictly. And Sakina, you're looking at me like...
Because I have a question that I want to ask you around that. Because do you think that is because they have opened themselves up and perhaps said much more than their predecessors had, just in the public discourse, on public platforms, because that was something that previously was almost, not something that we saw often.
So look, I think that we have had two Chief Justices that have had far greater appetite to speak publicly about what could, political issues than we had before. But remember also that the kind of cases that were being sent to the Constitutional Court and that the court was dealing with, in the first few years of the court, a lot of the cases that the court was dealing with were rights issues. Exactly what the court is meant to be dealing with were issues really about ventilating the and giving life to the different parts of the Constitution, mostly around Chapter 2, which is the Bill of Rights, but to some degree around other issues around the governance of the country. What we started to see, certainly I think in former President Zuma's second term, was matters being brought to the court that were far more around governance and the machinery of governance and politics in a way that we had not seen before. And so you had the court entering an area or a sphere that perhaps wasn't envisioned when the court was being established, and that then almost by default would force judges into a position to be asked around some of the issues that related to far more everyday politics than judging on the Constitution more generally or on the rule of law more generally. And so what will be interesting to see now is how the change in governance impacts the kind of pressures on the next Chief Justice Maya, and whether she will be put in a position to have to speak about some of these things, and whether she will take that up.
Yeah,
of course.
and whether she should, right?
And
Because that's
whether-
always been the,
Yes.
the debate in some instances. Dr. Sithembile Mbete, what a pleasure. Always great speaking to you, especially because there are so many different moving parts, and you've been able to help us connect the dots, so to speak, so well throughout the course of the morning. Dr. Sithembile Mbete, of course, speaking to us there as a political analyst.